The courtroom camera captured the exact moment when confident arrogance transformed into pure panic. Linda Patterson, a 42-year-old woman who had perfected the art of scamming elderly neighbors, sat in the plaintiff's chair with a self-satisfied smile plastered across her face. She had no idea that in exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, Judge Judy would ask her one simple question that would expose years of calculated fraud and send her entire fabricated story crashing down like a house of cards in a hurricane. What happened next became the fastest courtroom destruction ever captured on television, a masterclass in how decades of legal experience can dismantle even the most carefully constructed lies with surgical precision. Tati. Linda had walked into that courtroom believing she had executed the perfect scam. She carried a leather portfolio stuffed with 47 color photographs, meticulously organized repair receipts, printed text message conversations, and even a handwritten timeline of events that she had rehearsed until she could recite it in her sleep. This wasn't her first rodeo in small claims court. In fact, over the past 5 years, she had successfully sued 4 different neighbors for various property disputes, each time walking away with settlement money from elderly people who were too intimidated by the legal system to fight back. She had refined her strategy to an art form, targeting seniors who lived alone and fabricating property damage claims that were just expensive enough to be worth settling, but not so large that they would trigger serious investigations. Today was supposed to be payday number 5, a simple $5,000 claim against her 78-year-old neighbor, Mrs. Helen Chen, for fence damage that Linda claimed was caused by Mrs. Chen's supposedly dangerous tree during a violent storm. But Linda Patterson had made one fatal mistake. She had chosen to bring her carefully crafted scam into Judge Judy's courtroom. And Judge Judy had been destroying liars, frauds, and con artists since before Linda was born. Within the first 30 seconds of reviewing the case file that morning, Judge Judy's highly trained instincts had detected something that didn't smell right. The evidence was too perfect, too organized, too rehearsed. Real property disputes are messy, emotional, and full of gaps in documentation. Linda's case file looked like it had been prepared by a law firm, not a supposedly distressed homeowner. Judge Judy had seen this pattern before. Predators who target vulnerable elderly people with fraudulent claims, hoping that the cost of fighting would exceed the cost of settling. She had spent the previous evening doing something Linda never anticipated: actual research into Linda's litigation history, weather records for the area, and property documents that would prove to be Linda's undoing. Mrs. Helen Chen sat trembling in the defendant's chair, looking every bit the vulnerable elderly woman that Linda had calculated she would be. Helen's hands shook slightly as she clutched a simple manila folder containing just a few documents. Unlike Linda's theatrical presentation, Helen's evidence was sparse, almost pathetically so. She had no fancy photographs, no printed text messages, no timeline of events. She simply had her word, her confusion about why her neighbor of 15 years had suddenly turned hostile, and a deep fear that she might lose her home if she was forced to pay $5,000 she didn't have. Helen had immigrated to America 40 years ago, worked as a seamstress her entire life, and had finally paid off her modest home just 3 years before this nightmare began. She didn't understand legal procedures, didn't know how to prepare evidence, and was terrified of the entire court system. Linda had chosen her victim perfectly, or so she thought. The audience in Judge Judy's courtroom that day had no idea they were about to witness legal history. They settled into their seats, expecting the usual back-and-forth drama that made the show so addictively watchable. Some were regulars, retired folks who had watched Judge Judy demolish entitled people for decades. Others were tourists who had scored free tickets and were just hoping for some entertainment. Nobody in that room, except perhaps Judge Judy herself, understood that they were about to see a masterclass in investigative justice, a demonstration of how one perfectly timed question could unravel years of carefully constructed deception. Before we dive into the moment that destroyed Linda Patterson's entire scheme, before we reveal the one question that made this serial scammer's face drain of all color and her voice crack with genuine fear for the first time in years, you need to understand something crucial. What you're about to witness isn't just another courtroom case. This is the moment when preparation met deception and destroyed it completely. This is proof that no matter how carefully you plan your lies, experience and truth will always win. Linda Patterson approached the plaintiff's podium with the confidence of someone who had performed this exact routine multiple times before. Her appearance had been carefully calculated to project respectability and victimhood simultaneously. She wore a modest navy blue dress with a simple pearl necklace. Her hair was styled in a conservative manner that suggested suburban soccer mom rather than serial scammer. Her makeup was perfect but understated, designed to make her look trustworthy and sympathetic. She had practiced this look in the mirror for hours, understanding that in small claims court, perception was often more important than reality. As she began her testimony, her voice carried just the right mixture of indignation and wounded innocence that had worked so effectively in her previous cases. "Your Honor," Linda began, her voice steady and rehearsed, "I'm here today because my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, has been incredibly negligent with a dangerous tree on her property, and it has caused significant damage to our shared fence. On June 15th of this year, during a terrible storm, her massive oak tree dropped a large branch that completely destroyed a 30-foot section of the fence between our properties." She paused for effect, shaking her head with practiced disappointment before continuing. "I had warned her multiple times, Your Honor, multiple times about that tree. I told her it was dying, that the branches were unstable, that it was only a matter of time before something catastrophic happened. But she refused to listen. And now I'm left with thousands of dollars in damage that I shouldn't have to pay for." Linda then opened her leather portfolio with theatrical precision, pulling out photograph after photograph and spreading them across the podium like a dealer spreading cards. "Look at this damage, Your Honor," she continued, pointing at various images. "This is what her negligence has caused. I have 47 photographs here documenting the destruction from every possible angle. You can see the broken fence panels, the massive branch that fell, the damage to my property. I also have the repair estimates from 3 different contractors, all confirming that this will cost approximately $5,000 to fix properly." She produced the receipts with a flourish, each one conveniently highlighted and tabbed for easy reference. The level of organization was impressive, almost professional. But Linda wasn't finished. She pulled out printed text messages claiming they were her attempts to warn Mrs. Chen about the dangerous tree. "Your Honor, I have documentation showing that I texted her on April 3rd, April 17th, and May 2nd warning her about the tree's condition. She acknowledged receiving these messages but did nothing. I even offered to split the cost of having the tree professionally assessed, but she refused that too." Linda's voice took on an edge of righteous anger. "I've been patient, Your Honor. I've been more than reasonable. But after the storm on June 15th destroyed my fence, I realized I couldn't wait anymore. My property has been damaged, my sense of security has been violated, and I need this court to hold her accountable." Judge Judy had been listening to the entire testimony with an expression that regular viewers would recognize as dangerously calm. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her face, her eyes never leaving Linda's. Judge Judy had heard thousands of testimonies over her 35-year career and had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect deception within the first minute. Linda's story had every red flag that screamed fabrication. The testimony was too smooth, too rehearsed, too perfect. Real victims stumble, get emotional, forget details. Linda's presentation felt like an actress performing a monologue, not a genuinely distressed homeowner recounting a traumatic event. When Linda finally finished her statement, Judge Judy turned her attention to Mrs. Helen Chen with a much gentler tone. "Mrs. Chen, tell me your side of this situation." Helen's response was a stark contrast to Linda's polished performance. She spoke softly with a slight accent, her words hesitant and confused rather than confident. "Your Honor, I don't understand what she's talking about with a storm. I don't remember any storm on June 15th. My tree, it's very healthy. I have it inspected every year by the tree service because I'm careful about these things. They trim it, they check it, they tell me it's fine." Helen pulled out a single piece of paper from her manila folder, her hands shaking slightly as she did so. "This is my receipt from April when they came to inspect and trim the tree. They said it was in excellent condition, Lynn." Linda rolled her eyes dramatically, a calculated gesture designed to make Helen look like a confused elderly woman who couldn't remember basic facts. Judge Judy caught that eye roll, and her expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Helen continued, her voice growing even softer. "The fence, it has some damage, yes, but that damage has been there for many years. Little pieces break off over time because it's old. I've been saving money to replace it, but I'm on a fixed income, and fence replacement is very expensive. I never had any texts from her about the tree. She only started talking to me about the fence 2 months ago, saying I needed to pay her $5,000 or she would sue me. I told her I don't have $5,000 and that I didn't damage anything, and then she said she would take me to court." The courtroom atmosphere shifted noticeably. The audience members exchanged glances, their expressions suggesting they were beginning to suspect something wasn't quite right with Linda's story. Judge Judy was taking notes, her pen moving across the paper with deliberate strokes. She looked up at Linda with an expression that made Linda's confident smile falter for just a fraction of a second. "Ms. Patterson," Judge Judy said, her tone deceptively casual, "I have some questions for you. But first, let me make sure I understand your timeline correctly." The room went completely silent, and everyone could sense that something significant was about to happen. Linda straightened her shoulders, thinking she was prepared for whatever Judge Judy might ask, completely unaware that her entire fabricated story was about to collapse. Judge Judy closed Linda's evidence folder with deliberate slowness, the sound of the leather cover meeting the podium echoing through the silent courtroom like a warning shot. She leaned back in her chair, that iconic posture that every regular viewer knew meant someone was about to have their entire world turned upside down. Her eyes narrowed as she studied Linda Patterson's face with the intensity of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Linda, interpreting the pause as Judge Judy's need to process her impressive evidence, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She had done this before. She knew how these cases worked. Judges looked at the evidence, saw that one side had documentation while the other had nothing, and ruled in favor of the prepared party. In her mind, she had already won this case. She was mentally calculating how she would spend the $5,000, perhaps on a vacation or some new furniture. She had no idea that Judge Judy had spent the entire testimony cataloging every inconsistency, every too-perfect detail, every practiced gesture that screamed deception. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but was only about 15 seconds. The audience sat frozen, sensing that something monumental was building. The camera operators adjusted their positions slightly, instinctively understanding that whatever was about to happen needed to be captured perfectly. Mrs. Chen sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking small and vulnerable, hoping that somehow the truth would prevail despite her lack of polished evidence. Judge Judy's bailiff, who had worked with her for years and had seen her dismantle countless liars, shifted his weight slightly, recognizing the telltale signs that Judge Judy was about to deploy one of her legendary tactical strikes. This was the calm before the storm, the moment of stillness before the thunder. Judge Judy finally broke the silence, her voice cutting through the courtroom air with surgical precision. "Ms. Patterson," she began, her tone deceptively casual, "I have just one question for you before we proceed." Linda's posture straightened even more. She had prepared for dozens of potential questions, rehearsed answers about the tree, the fence, the damages, the timeline. She looked directly at Judge Judy with what she believed was an expression of earnest cooperation, ready to provide whatever clarification the judge needed. "Your Honor, I'm happy to answer any questions you have," Linda replied, her voice dripping with false humility. Judge Judy leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked onto Linda's face with an intensity that made several audience members unconsciously hold their breath. The question came out slowly, each word deliberate and heavy with purpose. "Miss Patterson, what was the exact date that this storm damaged your fence?" The question hung in the air like a live wire. To most people in the courtroom, it seemed simple, almost mundane. But Judge Judy's tone suggested something far more significant was happening beneath the surface. Linda, however, didn't catch the warning signs. She had mentioned the date multiple times already. This was an easy question, a softball. Linda answered without hesitation, her confidence growing. "June 15th, Your Honor. I remember it very clearly because it was my daughter's birthday. We had planned a party in the backyard, but the storm that morning was so severe that we had to move everything inside. It was quite traumatic, actually, watching that branch come crashing down during what should have been a celebration." She even added a small, sad smile for effect. Judge Judy nodded slowly as if accepting the answer. Linda felt a surge of victory. She thought she had passed the test. But then, Judge Judy reached beneath her desk and pulled out a document Linda hadn't seen before. The movement was smooth and practiced, like a magician revealing a card that would complete the trick. She held up the papers so the camera could capture the official letterhead at the top. "Ms. Patterson," Judge Judy said, her voice now carrying an edge that made Linda's confidence falter, "I have here the official weather records from the National Weather Service for this area covering the entire month of June." Linda's smile froze. A bead of sweat appeared on her forehead, visible even to the cameras. Judge Judy continued, her voice firm and clear. "According to these official government records, there was no storm in your area on June 15th. The courtroom erupted in quiet gasps and murmurs. Linda's face drained of color. Judge Judy wasn't finished. "In fact, Miss Patterson, there wasn't a significant storm anywhere in this region for 3 weeks before June 15th or 2 weeks after. The only notable weather event during that time was on July 8th, and that wasn't a storm at all. It was a heat wave, with temperatures reaching 98 degrees. She paused, letting the implications sink in. "So tell me again, Ms. Patterson, what storm are you talking about?" Linda's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Her entire case had just been demolished by official documentation she never imagined the judge would have. Her hands trembled, the confident grip on her portfolio loosening as panic overtook her composure. "Well, maybe I have the date wrong," she stammered. "Maybe it was a different day. The weather was bad. I know that for certain." The audience could see it happening in real time, the scammer being exposed, desperately backtracking to salvage something from the wreckage of her lie. But Judge Judy was just getting started, and Linda Patterson's nightmare was only beginning. Judge Judy's expression hardened as she watched Linda squirm. The weather records remained held up like irrefutable evidence. "Ms. Patterson," she said sharply, "you don't just forget the date of a storm that caused $5,000 worth of damage to your property. You certainly don't confuse it with your daughter's birthday. That's not the kind of detail people get wrong." The audience sat transfixed, watching the systematic destruction of what had seemed like an airtight case just moments before. Linda's face had gone from pale to blotchy red, her neck breaking out in nervous hives her makeup couldn't hide. But Judge Judy wasn't done. She set down the weather records and picked up the photographs Linda had so proudly displayed. "Let's examine your evidence more carefully, shall we?" she said, her tone cool and deliberate. She held up one of the photos, showing the damaged fence. "Ms. Patterson, these photographs are quite interesting. Very professional quality, excellent lighting, multiple angles, almost like they were taken by someone who knew exactly what they were doing." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "Tell me, when did you take these 47 photographs?" Linda's voice cracked. "Right after the storm, Your Honor. I wanted to document everything while the damage was fresh." Judge Judy's eyebrows rose. The look that millions of viewers knew meant one thing. Someone was about to be destroyed. "That's fascinating, Ms. Patterson," she said, "because digital photographs contain something called metadata. Do you know what metadata is?" Linda shook her head slightly, her confident demeanor now completely shattered and replaced with visible dread. "Metadata tells us exactly when a photograph was taken, what device was used, sometimes even the location." Judge Judy held up several of the photos. "These photographs weren't all taken on the same day, Ms. Patterson. According to the metadata, which I had my staff analyze yesterday, these images were taken over a period of 4 months. This photo was taken in March, this one in April, this one in May, and this one, the one showing the most damage, was taken just 2 weeks ago in early September." The courtroom exploded in murmurs and gasps. Linda's carefully constructed case was collapsing like a building in an earthquake, each revelation causing another structural failure. Mrs. Chen, who had been sitting quietly and looking confused, now had tears streaming down her face as she began to understand that someone had actually believed her simple truth over Linda's elaborate lies. Judge Judy wasn't finished with her systematic destruction. She picked up the repair receipts that Linda had presented as proof of her damages. "And these receipts, Ms. Patterson, let's talk about these for a moment. You claim you've already had the fence repaired, and that's why you need Mrs. Chen to reimburse you $5,000. But I made a few phone calls yesterday to these contractors whose names appear on these receipts." Linda's face went from splotchy red to completely white in an instant. Her hands gripped the edges of the podium so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Judge Judy continued with the relentless precision of a prosecutor closing in for the kill. "2 of these companies have never heard of you, Ms. Patterson. They have no record of ever doing work at your address. The 3rd company, Harrison Fencing, did come to your property for an estimate, but you never hired them to do any actual work. So these receipts you presented to this court are fabricated. They're fake. You created false documents and brought them into my courtroom as evidence. Do you understand the severity of what you've done?" Linda opened her mouth to respond, but only a strangled sound came out. Judge Judy wasn't waiting for an answer anyway. "But here's what makes your fraud truly despicable, Ms. Patterson." Judge Judy's voice took on a harder edge, the kind of tone that cut through excuses and justifications like a hot knife through butter. "I did some research into your litigation history. In the past 5 years, you filed small claim suits against 4 different neighbors. 4 different elderly neighbors, I should specify. Every single case followed the same pattern. Property damage claims ranging from $3,000 to $6,000, always against senior citizens living alone. Always settled out of court because your victims couldn't afford lawyers or were too intimidated by the legal system to fight back. You're not a victim, Ms. Patterson. You're a predator. You target vulnerable elderly people, fabricate property damage, create false evidence, and then bully them into paying you settlement money to avoid court." The audience's murmurs had turned into outright expressions of disgust and anger. Several people were shaking their heads, and one woman in the 3rd row audibly said, "That's despicable," loud enough for the microphones to pick up. Linda's attempt at maintaining any dignity had completely disintegrated. Tears were now streaming down her face, but these weren't the calculated tears of a performer trying to gain sympathy. These were tears of genuine panic and fear, as she realized the magnitude of trouble she was in. Your Honor, please! Linda's voice came out as a desperate whine. Nothing like the confident, rehearsed tone she had used when presenting her case. I can explain. This is all a misunderstanding. You don't understand the full situation. Judge Judy cut her off with a sharp gesture. Oh, I understand perfectly. Ms. Patterson, I understand that you thought you could come into my courtroom with your fabricated evidence and your rehearsed testimony and scam another elderly person out of money they don't have. What you didn't understand is that I've been doing this for 35 years. I've seen every type of scam, every variety of con artist, and every breed of fraud that exists. You're not original, Miss Patterson. You're just another predator who got caught. Linda tried one more desperate attempt at salvaging the situation. But the fence really is damaged, Your Honor. That part is true. Mrs. Chen's property is connected to mine, and there is damage that needs to be repaired. Judge Judy leaned forward, her eyes blazing with an intensity that made even the camera operators feel uncomfortable. Yes, Miss Patterson, there is damage to an old fence that has deteriorated over years of normal wear and tear. But you tried to turn natural deterioration into a fabricated storm damage claim so you could extract $5,000 from a 78-year-old woman living on a fixed income. And let's be absolutely clear about your endgame here. You weren't planning to use that money to fix any fence, were you? Your pattern with previous victims shows that you take settlement money and then never make any repairs. You're nothing more than a con artist who has found a profitable niche targeting senior citizens who are too scared or too poor to fight back. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted completely. What had started as a simple property dispute had been exposed as something far more sinister. A calculated fraud perpetrated by a serial scammer who had finally met her match. Judge Judy's final ruling came down with the force of a judicial hammer, swift and devastating in its completeness. The case is dismissed, she declared, her voice carrying absolute authority that left no room for appeal or negotiation. Ms. Patterson, you will receive nothing. Not 1 penny, not 1 cent. Your fabricated storm, your falsified evidence, and your calculated targeting of vulnerable elderly people ends today in my courtroom. But Judge Judy wasn't finished delivering consequences. She turned her attention to Mrs. Chen, whose tears of relief were now flowing freely as the weight of months of stress and fear finally lifted from her shoulders. Mrs. Chen, I am awarding you $2,500 for court costs, emotional distress, and the sheer harassment you've endured from this predator. Ms. Patterson will pay you, and she will pay you within 30 days or face additional legal consequences. Linda's legs seemed to give out slightly, and she grabbed the podium for support. Her face had gone beyond pale into a grayish tone that suggested she might actually faint on camera. But the worst was yet to come, and Judge Judy delivered it with the cold precision of someone who had waited their entire career for a case exactly like this one. Ms. Patterson, I am referring your case to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of multiple counts of fraud, perjury, and filing false police reports. The documents you brought into this courtroom as evidence are fabricated, which means you have committed perjury in my court. That is a criminal offense, not just a civil matter. The audience erupted in spontaneous applause, the kind of genuine reaction that couldn't be manufactured or rehearsed. They had just witnessed justice being served in its purest form. Linda's voice came out as a desperate wail that echoed through the courtroom. Your Honor, please, you can't do this to me. I have children. I have a family. I can't face criminal charges. Please, I'm begging you. This plea for mercy stood in stark contrast to the confident, condescending woman who had strutted into the courtroom just 20 minutes earlier. Judge Judy's response was ice-cold and absolutely merciless. You should have thought about your children before you decided to make a career out of defrauding elderly people. Ms. Patterson, you should have considered your family before you fabricated evidence and lied under oath in a court of law. Your actions have consequences, and those consequences start today. Sarah Martinez had a family too. Mrs. Chen has children who have watched their mothers suffer under your harassment. You showed them no mercy, and you will receive none from me." The bailiff moved forward as Judge Judy continued. "Furthermore, I am ordering that transcripts of this case be sent to the prosecutors handling your 4 previous settlements. Those cases need to be reopened and investigated. If your pattern of behavior holds, those settlements were obtained through fraud as well, and your previous victims deserve restitution." Linda was openly sobbing now, her designer dress wrinkled and her makeup running in dark streaks down her face. The leather portfolio that had contained her fake evidence lay scattered on the floor where it had fallen from her shaking hands. Security was already moving toward her, prepared to escort her from the courtroom as Judge Judy delivered her final words on the matter. "Ms. Patterson, you came into my courtroom thinking you were smarter than everyone else. You thought your preparation and fake evidence would overwhelm an elderly immigrant woman who couldn't afford a lawyer. But you forgot one crucial thing. Truth always has a way of revealing itself when the right questions are asked." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to seal Linda Patterson's fate permanently. "Court is adjourned. Mrs. Chen, you are free to go with my sincere apologies that you had to endure this harassment. Ms. Patterson, you will be hearing from the district attorney's office very soon." The courtroom remained in stunned silence for just a moment before erupting again in applause, this time even louder and more sustained. Mrs. Chen was surrounded by well-wishers from the audience, people patting her shoulder and telling her how brave she was. Linda was escorted out by security, her sobs echoing down the hallway even after she disappeared from view. The court's stenographer, who had been recording every word, later told colleagues that in 20 years of working in courtrooms, she had never seen such a complete and total destruction of a plaintiff's case in such a short period of time. Within 3 hours of the episode airing, the clip had been viewed over 2 million times on social media. By the end of the day, it had reached 15. The video gained millions of views and was trending on every major platform. The hashtag #OneQuestion went viral as people shared their own stories of standing up to scammers and bullies. Legal experts praised Judge Judy's methodical approach to exposing fraud, noting that her preparation and research had turned what could have been a he-said-she-said case into an ironclad exposure of criminal behavior. Local news stations in Linda's hometown picked up the story, running segments titled "Serial Scammer Exposed" on national television, and Judge Judy takes down neighborhood predator. Linda's face became instantly recognizable in her community, making it impossible for her to continue her pattern of targeting vulnerable neighbors. The district attorney's office moved quickly on Judge Judy's referral. Within 2 weeks, Linda Patterson was formally charged with 5 counts of fraud, 3 counts of perjury, and 2 counts of elder abuse. The prosecutors reached out to her 4 previous victims, all of whom came forward with strikingly similar stories of harassment, fabricated claims, and coerced settlements. What Linda thought would be an easy $5,000 payday had turned into criminal charges that could result in years in prison and mandatory restitution to all her victims. Mrs. Chen became a local hero, interviewed by news outlets about her experience and praised for her courage in standing up to a predator despite her fear and lack of resources. She used part of her $2,500 award to finally fix her fence properly, and her neighbors organized a community fundraiser that raised enough money to help her with other home repairs she had been putting off due to financial constraints. The case became a landmark moment in courtroom television history, studied by legal professionals and communication scholars as a perfect example of how proper investigation and one perfectly timed question can expose even the most carefully constructed lies. Judge Judy's methodical destruction of Linda's fabricated story reminded millions of viewers that justice still exists for those brave enough to stand up for truth, even when facing someone with more resources, better preparation, and seeming advantages. The moral was crystal clear. No amount of fake evidence, rehearsed testimony, or calculated targeting of vulnerable people can withstand the scrutiny of someone who knows exactly what questions to ask and refuses to be fooled by surface appearances. If this story of justice served and predators exposed moved you, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss another moment of Judge Judy delivering the accountability that scammers desperately need. Smash that like button if you believe one perfect question is worth more than 1,000 lies. Comment below what you would have asked Linda if you were in Judge Judy's chair. Share this video with anyone who needs to be reminded that truth always wins when it faces real experience and preparation. Remember, in Judge Judy's courtroom and in life, you can rehearse your lies all you want, but you can't prepare for someone who has seen every scam before and knows exactly how to expose it. The next time you think about cutting corners or manipulating the system, remember Linda Patterson and what happened when she faced someone who asked the one question she never prepared for. Justice is real. Accountability is inevitable. And Judge Judy proved once again why she remains the greatest courtroom legend in television history. Tony D. The courtroom cameras captured the exact moment when supreme confidence transformed into pure terror. Karen Stevens, a 42-year-old professional victim with perfectly styled blonde hair and a medical neck brace that cost more than most people's monthly rent, strutted into Judge Judy's courtroom like she owned the place. Her entrance was a masterclass in theatrical performance. Every step was calculated, every pause perfectly timed, every pained expression rehearsed in front of a mirror for maximum sympathy. She clutched a thick folder of medical documents in one hand, while the other rested dramatically on her lower back, suggesting injuries so severe that simply walking was an act of heroic courage. What Karen didn't know was that within seconds of opening her mouth, Judge Judy would catch a lie so obvious, so devastating, that it would expose the biggest insurance fraud scheme in the show's 25-year history. That frozen moment of realization, when Karen's face transformed from smug confidence to absolute horror, would become the most viral courtroom clip ever recorded, shared over 15 million times and forever, proving that you cannot fool America's greatest human lie detector. Karen had walked into that courtroom believing she had already won. After all, this was her fourth personal injury lawsuit in 5 years, and the previous 3 had been wildly successful money-making ventures. A shopping cart bump that somehow resulted in chronic back pain had netted her $18,000. A slip and fall at a restaurant, despite security footage showing no actual fall, had brought in $22,000. A supposedly defective door that injured her shoulder had settled for $15,000. She had perfected the art of exploiting the legal system, targeting small business owners who couldn't afford lengthy court battles and insurance companies that found it cheaper to settle than to fight. Each time, she walked away richer while her victims suffered financial devastation and emotional trauma. Today was supposed to be her biggest payday yet. $50,000 from an elderly grocery store owner for severe whiplash, from what police reports described as the gentlest parking lot tap in recorded history. She had her medical records, her witness statements from her sister who conveniently saw everything, and her perfectly practiced testimony about unbearable pain and permanent disability. The defendant, Robert Chen, sat trembling in his chair, looking every bit like the victim he actually was. At 73 years old, this kind immigrant had spent 4 decades building his small neighborhood grocery store from nothing. He had arrived in America with $17 in his pocket and a dream of providing for his family through honest hard work. Every dollar he earned went back into his business and his community. He employed local teenagers, gave credit to families struggling between paychecks, and donated unsold food to homeless shelters. His store wasn't just a business. It was a community cornerstone where neighbors gathered, where elderly residents could shop without traveling far, where everyone knew his name and trusted his character. Now, at an age when he should have been enjoying retirement with his grandchildren, he faced financial ruin because a woman had backed into his parked car at approximately 2 miles per hour and decided to turn that minor incident into a jackpot lawsuit. The incident itself was almost comically insignificant. Security footage from Robert's own parking lot showed the entire encounter with crystal clarity. Karen's SUV had reversed slowly into Robert's parked sedan with barely enough force to leave a scratch. The impact was so minimal that Robert, who had been loading groceries into his trunk, didn't even feel it. Karen had immediately jumped out of her vehicle, and here's where the footage became interesting. She walked perfectly normally around both vehicles, inspecting for damage, showing no signs of pain or distress whatsoever. She bent down to examine the bumpers, turned her head in all directions to look at different angles, and gestured animatedly while speaking to Robert. Then, after exchanging insurance information and driving away without incident, she returned 20 minutes later with a completely different demeanor. Suddenly, she was limping, wincing, clutching her neck, and demanding that Robert call an ambulance immediately. What Robert didn't know at the time was that those 20 minutes had been spent calling her lawyer, rehearsing her injury story, and preparing for what she thought would be an easy settlement. What Karen didn't know was that Robert's security system was far more sophisticated than she assumed, capturing not just the collision but her entire performance before and after. And what neither of them knew was that Judge Judy had spent the previous evening reviewing every frame of that footage, making notes, spotting inconsistencies, and preparing to dismantle Karen's fraud with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a prosecutor who had seen this con game 1,000 times before. Before we witness the most satisfying few seconds of courtroom justice ever recorded, hit that subscribe button right now, because what Judge Judy does to this lying fraudster will restore your faith that truth and justice still matter in America. The courtroom atmosphere was electric with anticipation as Karen Stevens prepared to deliver what she believed would be an Oscar-worthy performance. She had positioned herself carefully in the plaintiff's chair, adjusting her neck brace for maximum visibility to the cameras. Her lawyer, a tired-looking man named Gerald Mitchell who specialized in personal injury cases, sat beside her with the resigned expression of someone who had heard this same story too many times. Karen placed her tissue box within easy reach, set her water bottle at the perfect angle for dramatic sips during emotional moments, and arranged her medical folder so that its impressive thickness would be visible to everyone in the courtroom. She had practiced this routine so many times that every movement was automatic, every gesture designed to communicate suffering and vulnerability. The audience members watched with varying degrees of sympathy and skepticism, but Karen only cared about one person in that room, Judge Judy Scheindlin. The judge sat behind her bench with an expression of complete neutrality, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on Karen with the intensity of a predator studying prey. Judge Judy had already made her assessment before Karen even opened her mouth. In 25 years of presiding over tens of thousands of cases, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot liars, frauds, and scam artists within the first 30 seconds of meeting them. Karen Stevens had triggered every single alarm bell the moment she walked through those courtroom doors. The overly dramatic limp that somehow got worse when she thought people were watching, the neck brace that looked brand new despite supposedly being worn for months, the way her eyes darted around the room calculating who was buying her performance, and the slight smirk that appeared when she thought no one was looking. But Judge Judy wasn't just relying on instinct. She had spent hours reviewing the case file, the security footage, the medical records, and, most importantly, Karen's history. She had discovered a pattern that would make any prosecutor salivate. What Karen thought was her secret weapon, her medical documentation and witness statements, was actually going to become the rope she would hang herself with. Judge Judy just needed to give her enough room to do it. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Judy began with her signature no-nonsense approach. Her voice cut through the courtroom air like a scalpel, clear and commanding. "Mrs. Stevens, you're suing Mr. Chen for $50,000, claiming you suffered severe whiplash and permanent neck injury from a collision in a parking lot. Tell me exactly what happened at the moment of impact." It was a deceptively simple question, the kind Judge Judy had asked thousands of times before. But this question was a carefully constructed trap, and Karen was about to walk right into it with the confidence of someone who had no idea she was being hunted. Karen took a deep breath, touched her neck brace gently, as if even that small movement caused pain, and began her rehearsed testimony. "Your Honor, I was sitting in my car, completely stopped, minding my own business, when suddenly—" And this was where everything fell apart. To emphasize the sudden violence of the impact, Karen threw both arms dramatically above her head in a sweeping gesture. Her hands stretched toward the ceiling to demonstrate how the collision had supposedly jolted her body forward and back. It was a natural instinct, the kind of physical demonstration people make without thinking when describing a shocking event. But the moment her arms reached their full extension above her head, with her neck rotating smoothly to look upward at her own hands, reality crashed down on her like a physical force. Judge Judy's face remained completely still, but one eyebrow raised slowly, deliberately, like a drawbridge ascending to reveal the truth behind the facade. The silence that followed was deafening. Only a few seconds had passed since Karen began speaking. Seconds that would destroy her entire case, expose years of fraud, and turn her into one of the most hated people on the internet. Karen's arms froze in midair, her hands still stretched toward the ceiling, her neck fully extended in a position her medical records claimed was completely impossible. Her face underwent a transformation that the cameras captured in excruciating detail. The confident, practiced expression of a victim recounting trauma melted away like wax near a flame. Confusion flashed across her features as her brain registered what her body had just done. Then came the horrifying realization as she understood that everyone in the courtroom, including Judge Judy, had just witnessed her, completely mobile neck moving freely through a range of motion she had sworn under oath was medically impossible. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened slightly, and for several long seconds that felt like an eternity. She simply stood there frozen with her arms above her head like a cartoon character who had just run off a cliff and hadn't yet looked down. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the camera operators breathing. Even the stenographer had stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keys as she watched this spectacular self-destruction unfold in real time. Karen's hands slowly lowered from their elevated position like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Her brain was working frantically to construct some explanation, any explanation, that could undo what had just happened. But the damage was already done, captured on multiple cameras from different angles, witnessed by everyone in the courtroom, and most importantly, observed by Judge Judy, whose expression had shifted from neutral observation to barely concealed satisfaction. Karen's mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out, and when they finally did, they tumbled forth in a stammering mess of half-formed excuses. The physical therapy has helped somewhat. Not completely, of course, but some movement has returned. My doctor said that occasional range of motion is possible, but it's extremely painful and I shouldn't do it. I forgot myself for a moment because I was so caught up in describing the trauma of that terrible accident. Her voice got quieter with each word, as she realized that every syllable was digging her grave deeper. Judge Judy let the silence hang in the air for another few seconds, allowing Karen's pathetic explanation to echo through the courtroom and reveal itself for the desperate lie it was. Then she leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Karen's face, and spoke with the kind of cold precision that had made her a legend. "I see your neck can't turn more than 2 inches in any direction according to your medical records. You claim you cannot look up, down, or side to side without excruciating pain. You've testified that you require a neck brace at all times, and that any sudden movement could cause permanent damage. But apparently, when you're enthusiastically describing an accident, you can throw your arms above your head and crane your neck back like you're watching fireworks on the 4th of July. That's very interesting, Miss Stevens. Very interesting indeed." The courtroom audience murmured with a mixture of shock and satisfaction. Several people actually laughed, quickly stifling themselves when the bailiff gave them a warning look. Karen's lawyer, Gerald Mitchell, had his head in his hands. He had suspected this case might be problematic, but watching his client literally demonstrate her own fraud within the first minute of testimony was a new low, even for his depressing career. Judge Judy was just getting started. She opened a folder on her bench and pulled out several printed frames from the security footage that Robert Chen had provided. "Ms. Stevens, I've reviewed the parking lot security footage from Mr. Chen's grocery store very carefully, multiple times. In fact, I found it absolutely fascinating. Would you like to know what I found so fascinating about it?" Karen's face had gone pale, but she managed a weak nod. Judge Judy held up the first image. This frame was taken at exactly 2:47 p.m., the moment of impact. As you can see, the contact between your vehicle and Mr. Chen's parked car was so minimal that neither vehicle moved more than an inch. The impact was equivalent to someone tapping you on the shoulder to get your attention. But let's move forward, shall we? She held up a second image. This frame was taken 30 seconds after the collision. Here you are, Miss Stevens, walking around both vehicles with perfect posture. No limping, no holding your neck, no signs of distress whatsoever. A third image joined the display. This frame shows you bending completely forward at the waist to examine the bumper damage. Your neck is bent at approximately 60 degrees, which, according to your medical expert, is impossible given your claimed injuries. Karen tried to interrupt, her voice rising in pitch with desperation. "Your Honor, the pain didn't start immediately. Sometimes whiplash symptoms take hours or even days to appear. That's medically documented. My doctor can explain." Judge Judy cut her off with a raised hand, her voice sharp as broken glass. "I'm not finished, Miss Stevens. Please don't interrupt me again." The authority in her tone made Karen shrink back in her chair. Judge Judy continued, pulling out more images. Here's a particularly interesting sequence. At 2:52 p.m., 5 minutes after this supposedly devastating collision, we see you turning your head a full 180 degrees to yell something at Mr. Chen. Your mouth is open. Your neck is fully rotated to the left, and I can even see the tendons in your neck standing out from the force of whatever you were shouting. Then at 2:54 p.m., you bend down to pick up your cell phone that you dropped. You squat completely down, retrieve the phone, and stand back up without using your hands for support. For someone claiming permanent cervical damage, you move remarkably well when you think no one important is watching. The evidence was devastating, but Judge Judy had saved her knockout punch for last. She pulled out a thick document and held it up for the courtroom to see. Now, Miss Stevens, let's talk about your medical history. Specifically, let's talk about your personal injury claim history. This isn't your first rodeo, is it? Karen's face transformed from pale to completely ashen. Her hands started trembling, and she reached for her water bottle with shaking fingers, nearly knocking it over in her panic. Judge Judy's question hung in the air like an executioner's blade waiting to fall. Karen Stevens sat frozen in her chair, her trembling hands wrapped around her water bottle, her eyes darting desperately between her lawyer and the exit, as if she were calculating whether she could simply run away from this nightmare. But there was no escape from Judge Judy's courtroom, and there was certainly no escape from the truth that was about to be revealed to millions of viewers. Karen's lawyer, Gerald Mitchell, looked like a man who had just realized he had been played for a fool. He leaned away from his client slightly, as if physical distance might somehow protect him from the legal disaster that was unfolding. The audience leaned forward collectively, sensing that something massive was about to be exposed. Judge Judy let the tension build for another few seconds before continuing, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Let me answer my own question. Miss Stevens, since you seem to have lost the ability to speak, no, this is not your first personal injury lawsuit. In fact, you've become quite the professional victim over the past 5 years. Judge Judy opened the thick document and began reading with the clinical precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. In October 2019, you filed a personal injury claim against Save-A-Mart supermarket, alleging that a shopping cart was pushed into you by an employee, causing severe lower back injuries. You claimed you couldn't sit for more than 20 minutes without excruciating pain. You claimed you needed special ergonomic furniture and ongoing chiropractic treatment. The case settled out of court for $18,000. Karen tried to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. That was a real injury. I was hurt, the doctor said. Judge Judy's hand shot up, silencing her immediately. I'm not asking you questions right now, Miss Stevens. I'm telling you what I know. Please sit quietly and listen. The rebuke was so sharp that Karen physically flinched. Judge Judy continued, her voice growing harder with each revelation. In March 2021, you sued Bella Italy restaurant for $25,000, claiming you slipped on a wet floor and injured your neck and shoulder. Interestingly, the security footage from that incident, which I've also reviewed, shows no actual fall. You're seen walking normally through the restaurant, then suddenly you're on the floor calling for help. The restaurant owner, a single mother supporting 3 children, couldn't afford a lengthy legal battle. She settled for $22,000 and had to close her business 6 months later due to increased insurance premiums. The courtroom erupted in gasps and angry murmurs. The audience was beginning to understand that they weren't watching a simple personal injury case. They were witnessing the exposure of a serial predator who had been destroying innocent people's lives for profit. Robert Chen, who had been sitting quietly throughout the proceedings, began to cry softly as he realized he wasn't alone, that there were other victims just like him who had been targeted by this woman's calculated cruelty. Judge Judy wasn't finished. In August 2022, you filed another lawsuit, this time against Henderson Hardware Store, claiming a defective automatic door closed on you and injured your shoulder, requiring surgery and months of physical therapy. The store owner, a 78-year-old veteran who had run that hardware store for 40 years, paid you $15,000 to make you go away. He died of a heart attack 3 months later. His family believes the stress of your lawsuit contributed to his death. The last revelation hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Several audience members audibly gasped. One woman in the back row stood up and pointed at Karen, shouting, "You should be in jail!" before the bailiff gently asked her to sit down. Karen's carefully constructed facade had completely crumbled. Tears were streaming down her face. But these weren't the practiced tears of a professional victim. These were tears of genuine panic. The tears of someone who had just realized that their entire house of cards was collapsing, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. She pulled at her neck brace frantically, as if the prop that had served her so well in previous scams had suddenly become a noose tightening around her throat. Her lawyer had physically pushed his chair away from her, creating visible distance between himself and his disgraced client. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair, her expression a mixture of disgust and grim satisfaction. But wait, there's more, Miss Stevens. Because I don't just read case files, I do real investigation. I had my team pull your medical records from all 4 of your injury claims. And do you know what we discovered? Every single medical report supporting your injuries came from the same doctor, Dr. Marcus Webb of Webb Medical Associates. Now, I found that quite interesting, so I made some calls. Dr. Webb is currently under investigation by the State Medical Board for providing fraudulent medical documentation to support insurance claims. He's been doing this for years, running what amounts to a medical fraud mill, where people like you pay him to create whatever diagnosis you need to support your lawsuits. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. This wasn't just one woman filing fraudulent lawsuits. This was an organized conspiracy involving medical professionals, a systematic scheme to defraud insurance companies and destroy small business owners. Judge Judy pulled out another set of documents, and Karen visibly shrank in her chair as if trying to disappear. But here's my favorite part, Miss Stevens, claiming total disability, unable to work, suffering constant pain that prevents normal activities. My private investigator has been following you. And boy, did he get some interesting footage. Judge Judy held up several printed photographs like a poker player revealing a royal flush. This photo was taken last Tuesday at Fitness World Gym. That's you, Miss Stevens, in a yoga class executing a perfect upward dog pose. Your neck is fully extended backward, supporting your body weight. For someone who claims they can't turn their neck more than 2 inches, you're remarkably flexible. She held up another photo. This one was taken Thursday at Riverside Shopping Mall. That's you carrying 6 heavy shopping bags, 2 in each hand and 2 more over your shoulders. No neck brace, no signs of pain, walking with perfect posture, and moving your head freely in all directions as you window shop. A third photo joined the evidence pile, and this gem was taken Saturday at Lincoln Park during your son's baseball game. That's you turning your head rapidly back and forth to follow the ball, jumping up and down, celebrating a home run, and hugging other parents with enough force to lift one of them completely off the ground. All of this occurred during the same week you filed sworn statements claiming you couldn't perform basic daily activities without assistance. Karen Stevens had no defense left, no explanations that could possibly explain away the mountain of evidence that Judge Judy had systematically laid out before the entire courtroom and millions of television viewers. Her body language had completely transformed from the confident, suffering victim who had walked in 40 minutes earlier to a hunched, defeated woman whose entire world was crashing down around her. She reached up with shaking hands and ripped the neck brace off completely, throwing it onto the table in front of her in a gesture of frustration and defeat. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. The prop that had been central to her fraud, the physical manifestation of her lies, was now just a piece of foam and plastic sitting uselessly on a table. Her face was blotchy and red from crying, her carefully applied makeup running in dark streams down her cheeks. When she finally spoke, her voice was completely different from the confident, articulate woman who had begun her testimony. Now she sounded desperate, cornered, and utterly broken. Your Honor, please. You don't understand. Those other cases were real. I was really hurt. Maybe this one got exaggerated a little bit, but I needed the money. My family is struggling. My husband lost his job. We have bills piling up. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I just needed help. And the insurance companies have so much money, and these businesses all have insurance anyway, so nobody really gets hurt. And the words tumbled out in a frantic stream of consciousness, each excuse contradicting the last, each justification revealing more of her twisted logic that had allowed her to rationalize destroying innocent people's lives for profit. Judge Judy cut her off with a voice like ice. Stop talking, Miss Stevens. Every word that comes out of your mouth is making this worse for you. You just admitted under oath that you exaggerated this case. You just confessed to insurance fraud on national television. Do you understand what you've done? Karen's eyes widened as the reality of her confession hit her. Her lawyer dropped his pen and put both hands over his face in complete despair. Judge Judy leaned forward, her voice carrying the full weight of her authority and decades of legal experience. Miss Stevens, you are not a victim. You are a predator. You target hard-working people who have spent their lives building something meaningful, and you destroy them for pocket change. Robert Chin worked for 40 years to build his grocery store. He employs people from his community. He gives credit to struggling families. He donates food to shelters. And you tried to bankrupt him over a parking lot tap that caused zero damage to either vehicle. That restaurant owner who settled with you, she lost everything. Her business closed. Her dream died. Her children watched their mother cry herself to sleep at night because of you. And that hardware store owner? His family believes the stress of fighting your fraudulent lawsuit contributed to his death. These aren't faceless corporations. These are real people whose lives you've devastated without a single moment of genuine remorse. The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of Karen's sobbing. Judge Judy picked up her gavel but didn't strike it yet. She had more to say, and every word was going to count. Here is my ruling. The case is dismissed with prejudice. Not only do you get nothing, Miss Stevens, but you are going to pay Mr. Chen's legal fees, which amount to $8,500. But that's just the beginning of your problems. I am forwarding the complete transcript of this case, along with all evidence presented here today, to the district attorney's office. You will be facing criminal charges for insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and perjury for lying under oath in this courtroom. Given the pattern of behavior over multiple years and multiple victims, you're looking at serious prison time. 2 to 5 years is the standard sentence for serial fraud of this nature. Karen let out a wail of despair that echoed through the courtroom. She reached toward Judge Judy with both hands, as if physically begging for mercy. Please, Your Honor, please. I have children. I can't go to prison. I'll pay back the money. I'll admit everything. Please don't send this to the prosecutor. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll never do this again. I swear. Judge Judy's expression didn't soften even slightly. You should have thought about your children before you became a career criminal, Miss Stevens. You should have thought about them before you destroyed other people's families for profit. Your children deserve a mother who teaches them integrity and honesty, not one who shows them that lying and fraud are acceptable ways to make money. Maybe prison will give you time to reflect on the kind of example you've been setting. Judge Judy turned her attention to Robert Chen, and her voice softened considerably. Mr. Chen, I want to apologize on behalf of our legal system that allowed this woman to torment you for months. You did nothing wrong. The collision was so minor it barely qualifies as an accident. You've conducted yourself with dignity and grace throughout this ordeal. Your community is lucky to have you, and I hope this judgment brings you some peace. Robert stood up slowly, tears streaming down his weathered face, and bowed deeply to Judge Judy in gratitude. The courtroom erupted in applause, and for once Judge Judy allowed it to continue for several seconds before gaveling for order. The final strike of the gavel echoed through the courtroom like a period at the end of a sentence. Karen was escorted out by the bailiff, her sobs still audible as she disappeared through the exit. Her lawyer gathered his papers in defeated silence, already mentally preparing for the inevitable state bar investigation that would follow his involvement in this disaster. Robert Chen was surrounded by supporters and well-wishers, people who had watched the proceedings and wanted to shake his hand and tell him they were proud of his courage to fight back. The footage of Karen's frozen moment, arms above her head, demonstrating the full mobility of her supposedly injured neck, was uploaded to social media within minutes of the episode airing. Within 24 hours, it had been viewed over 15 million times across every platform. The hashtag Judge Judy Carter trended #1 worldwide. Thousands of comments poured in from people sharing their own experiences with fraudulent injury claims, celebrating the fact that justice had finally been served in such spectacular fashion. Legal commentators and personal injury attorneys were interviewed on news programs, with many calling it the most clear-cut case of insurance fraud exposure in television history. The real-world consequences for Karen Stevens extended far beyond the courtroom. The district attorney filed formal charges within a week, citing the television testimony as primary evidence. Dr. Marcus Webb, the physician who had provided fraudulent medical documentation for all 4 of Karen's injury claims, had his medical license suspended pending investigation. His patient files were subpoenaed, revealing a network of fraudulent claims involving 23 other individuals over a 5-year period. Insurance companies launched a coordinated investigation into the fraud ring, ultimately recovering over $2 million in fraudulent settlements. Karen's previous victims, including the family of the deceased hardware store owner, began filing civil suits to recover their settlements plus additional damages. The restaurant owner, who had been forced to close her business, was able to reopen after a community fundraising campaign raised enough money to cover her startup costs. 9 other defendants who had settled with Karen were granted case reversals and refunds of their settlement payments. Robert Chen became a local hero after the episode aired. His grocery store saw a massive increase in business as people from across the city came to support him. A GoFundMe campaign started by loyal customers raised $95,000 to help cover his legal expenses and compensate for months of stress and lost revenue from dealing with the lawsuit. Robert used part of the money to establish a legal defense fund for other small business owners facing fraudulent injury claims. 3 months after the episode aired, Karen Stevens pleaded guilty to 4 counts of insurance fraud, 1 count of conspiracy, and 1 count of perjury to avoid a lengthy trial. She was sentenced to 3 years in state prison and ordered to pay $180,000 in restitution to her victims. During her sentencing hearing, she read a prepared statement apologizing for her actions. But even the judge presiding over her criminal case noted that her remorse seemed performative rather than genuine, much like her injury claims had been. The case became a landmark moment in television history, studied by law students as an example of how quickly and completely a fraudulent case can unravel when confronted with proper investigation and a judge who refuses to be fooled. Judge Judy's methodical destruction of Karen's lies, her preparation and research, and her willingness to go beyond the surface claims to uncover a pattern of criminal behavior became a masterclass in legal procedure and critical thinking. The 4-second moment when Karen demonstrated her perfectly functional neck while claiming total disability became shorthand in legal circles for obvious self-implication. The moment when a witness destroys their own credibility so completely that no further questioning is necessary. Insurance companies began implementing stricter verification procedures for personal injury claims, specifically citing the Judge Judy case as an example of red flags that should trigger deeper investigation. Medical boards increased oversight of physicians providing injury documentation, making it significantly harder for fraud mills like Dr. Webb's practice to operate. The moral of Karen Stevens's spectacular downfall resonated far beyond the courtroom. It reminded viewers that truth always has a way of revealing itself, especially when it encounters someone with the intelligence, preparation, and authority to expose it. Karen had spent years believing she was smarter than the system, that she could manipulate emotions and exploit sympathy to profit from other people's hard work. She had convinced herself that insurance companies were faceless entities, and that small business owners could afford to lose because they had coverage. She had rationalized her fraud by claiming financial need as if being in debt somehow justified destroying other families who were also struggling. But in the end, all her rationalizations, all her rehearsed performances, and all her fraudulent documentation couldn't stand up to 4 seconds of honest scrutiny. One unconscious gesture, one natural movement made without thinking had exposed years of lies and destroyed the facade she had so carefully constructed. Smash that subscribe button if you believe that justice still matters, and that liars always get caught eventually. Comment below with a target emoji if you think Judge Judy is the greatest lie detector of all time. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that truth always wins, and that trying to cheat the system will eventually result in consequences far worse than any temporary financial struggle. Because at the end of the day, Karen Stevens learned the hardest possible lesson. When you build your life on lies, it only takes 4 seconds of truth to bring the whole thing crashing down.